Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first of this week's Lean In. As always, I'm Michael Linky, and on behalf of the Australian Institute of Architects, it's great to have you with me for this next hour. Today's session, we're going to be looking at an employment economic update, and I'm once again really pleased to be able to welcome Krista Shearer, the Managing Director from Sydney, and Bianca Nicastro, the Principal from Melbourne, from Bespoke Careers. And today we're going to be looking at a deeper dive into the architectural employment trends and forecasts and what the recent implications of the Melbourne lockdown has been doing to not only the job market in Victoria, but also really across the country. This is an opportunity for us to maybe dispel some myths and to uncover some of the truths that are happening in the architectural profession and the wider construction and design industry as well. So Krista Shearer and Bianca Nicastro, thanks very much for joining me. Welcome to the program. How are you both today?
Hi, really well, coming from Sydney.
And Thanks, Bianca, how are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you.
Great to have you both with us. So I thought what I would do is just hand it over to you first of all. I will say for those of you on the chat today as well, there is no PowerPoint presentation. This is just going to be a pure Q&A. And if you want to get involved, there is a chat box as always. The chat box is your friend. So if you have any questions, feel free just to pop your questions into the chat box. And then I'll go through these, time permitting, with Krista and Bianca throughout the program as well. But first of all, let's cast to you first, Krista, based in Sydney.
Yep.
If you can give us a bit of a, I suppose, a State of the Union address on what's happening in the employment market for architects at the moment.
Thanks. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Michael, for inviting us to join in today's Lean In session. We're really happy to share the trends we've been experiencing from our perspective. Just a reminder on our perspective, each week we're speaking with lots of architects globally. We've got offices in the US and the UK and Australia. We're obviously speaking to people who've sadly lost their roles and looking for new positions through Bespoke Network. And also we're speaking with our clients, many of those who are looking to recruit for their teams, whether it be for an architect, interior designer, marketing, business support role. I'll give you a brief overview of the market since we last spoke at the beginning of April in the Lean In session. The market was very much in shock and there were redundancies and practices standing people down while practices migrated to remote working. We have seen redundancies in March and a second wave around June, July, globally as practices have reconciled their pipelines and contracted where needed. The JobKeeper extension announcements have alleviated some concern and are providing a much needed bridge for some through to 2021 in Australia, which is really great. Following Easter through May, June, July, there was stabilisation here and things have continued to improve across Australia and New Zealand outside of Victoria. Surprisingly and really positively, some practice have reported no change in workload and have 3 to 6 months of work in their pipeline. This is very dependent on the size and the sector of practices, of course. We've seen a trend globally that smaller mid to size practices seem to have been the ones recruiting through this period. In terms of applications for job seekers, we've seen the numbers drop through lockdown and now they're back up to about 180 to 200 a day into our Sydney office, which is sort of giving you an idea of the normal level. There have been practices hiring throughout every stage of lockdowns everywhere globally, so there's always hope for people who have unfortunately lost their employment through the pandemic. In Sydney and across Brisbane, we're probably sitting at around 60% of the roles we were working on pre-pandemic in February. I'll give you a bit of a location-specific update for Sydney. There's still a steady demand for architects, but there's a lot of competition for roles. The busy sectors include private residential, education, some infrastructure, landscape architecture and multi-residential. In general, the market is better for mid-level versatile candidates and people with strong Revit and ArchiCAD software skills. We're not seeing as much demand for grads or more senior candidates. Requests for contractors is definitely up, but salaries have dropped a bit too on that front. Landscape roles are really busy, both scales from public realm down to residential. Niche roles like heritage architects are still really hard to fill even in this climate. Outside of New South Wales, Brisbane seems to be the most buoyant across Australia, with urban landscape remaining strong. Multi-residential seems to have picked up significantly in the Gold Coast and Brisbane, and we've seen some demand there over the past few months. Nationally, at strategic level, we've seen lots of roles for niche experience and sector leads like hospital, healthcare, infrastructure and education has been steady. I think retail and hospitality have suffered the most globally. We're seeing a lot of interest in Australian talent that's returning from overseas as well. Following the recent wave in Victoria, some national practices have been looking to resource from other states. There seems to be optimism this week, though, with Victorian practices seeing a path out and a time frame out of lockdown emerging, so fingers crossed on that front. Globally, in New York, practices are starting to recover. While there are some large-scale redundancies across New York through the pandemic, they're now starting to hire, and the international practices seem to continue to work on international projects and competitions. I'd say that LA is recovering a bit more slowly as they've had a worse second wave, but the market is starting to move and people are hiring again. In the UK, people are coming back from furlough and people are looking to hire for some roles. There's been an increase in demand from contract and casual architects there as well. Bianca, I'll let you update on what's happening in Victoria.
Yep, thanks, Krista. So stage 1 restrictions allowed everyone basically to adjust to remote working setup, and stage 2 restrictions have created a bit more of a pause and a slight uncertainty for pipeline of work for practices. There's been conflicting uncertainty with construction restrictions, reduced workers on sites and the delivery of projects. However, this week there seems to have settled a little with a few extra updates, hopefully not impacting too many project timeframes. We have found that potential new hires through this recent period has at times resulted in start dates being pushed back in line with further restrictions. Although it's caused some uncertainty with start dates, ultimately practices are still securing talent with some flexibility where necessary. We found an increase in contract positions versus permanent, whereby practices want to take people on permanently in order to get the right fit. However, as strong profile candidates are available immediately, there is more adjustment into commencing people on contract to secure them in the team. As such, short-term fixed-term contracts or hourly rate contracts with a view to transition into permanent roles should the project work be there is more commonly the direction for long-term commitment. As there are many people out of jobs, there's prime candidates that wouldn't typically consider working in a contract position, however, are now open to it, which is a positive in securing strong talent with short-term projection. We've seen more onboarding and success stories of people interviewing through Zoom and Microsoft Teams and working remotely. I, for example, had an excellent mid-scale practice that would have hired a permanent candidate last week if the market was in a different state. However, opted for offering a contract role instead, whereby they interviewed and onboarded all virtually. They also had a laptop couriered to the candidate's house, ready for the first day. This does show how the industry is adapting to these ever-changing circumstances. Thanks, Krista.
Thank you both. That was a very comprehensive global overview. I suppose my first question to you really, and thank you for that, it's raised a number of questions, but I will go through with them, go through those with you a bit later on. Let's first of all talk about, you talked about the New York market, you talked about the LA market, you know, experiencing a second wave. We have, as you well know, here in Melbourne, a significant second wave. It's resulted really in the government introducing significant restrictions on our daily operations and a curfew from 8 p.m. till 5 a.m. I mean, this is probably a question really for you, Bianca. In terms of the recent restrictions we've had here in Victoria, what has that meant for architects, specifically in Melbourne CBD, and also the regions which are now also being affected?
With regards to Melbourne, well, from Bespoke's perspective, we are lucky in that we have, in regards to the virus, it's directly flowed onto our market. So the first stage lockdown was fast and sharp, where we saw an immediate pause, versus sort of the UK and the US markets that was slower to react, and the delays affected the market there. So far for Australia, there seems to have more successful approach to remote working and more resilient market. With regards to the scale of practices, there's also seemed to be in favour of small to mid-size and able to adapt and adjust more quickly in making a recovery a bit more speedier. So in regards to, I suppose, how lockdown restrictions have affected, I suppose, the architectural sector here in Melbourne, it's, I suppose, giving a bit of a difference between New South Wales and Victoria, let's say. I'd say the first lockdown restrictions in March across New South Wales and Victoria did put a pause across recruitment at approximately 90%, let's say, going on hold. But practices had to immediately shift to working remotely and assess their resources for current workloads. So ultimately, some projects going on hold meant roles going on hold, but put a pause for active recruitment drives and candidates in the middle of interview processes. So we have seen some of that stalling happening there. But we have seen offers materialise and people start in roles in offices and working remotely over the past few months. I suppose the second lockdown, we have seen start dates pushed out. However, most practices are still keen to lock in top talent. We've also seen practices start people on, say, 3-month contracts to allow some flexibility within their commitments in case there is further changes down the track. And practices are getting better at doing interviews via Zoom and starting people in offices initially, and then they become inducted, supporting them to work from home in various combinations. We've also seen a lot of candidates actually that are tested with software skills and in some cases have their own licenses and computer setups. They're quite in demand at the moment as well.
Can I ask you one question? Just in Victoria, this is a question that's just come in from Suki on the chat, and she says, look, she's heard that there has been drops in salaries. We know it's an employer's market. We know that there's a glut of candidates. And some of the comments that we've heard at the Institute, which give us a little cause for concern, is the fact that, yes, we've got a talented candidate, but we can pay chicken's feed for them because the jobs are few and far between. What is your response to something like that?
Look, I'd say I know from all regions, when supply and demand, I guess if people have got more people to choose from who are willing to take less because they're out of work, I think that's where that's probably coming from. And we have definitely seen things plateauing and rates being pushed down for contractors and casual rates. So, I mean, it's hard, isn't it? It's kind of a tough spot to be in, but I think people just have to try and stick to what they were looking for before and the skills that they've got. Always above award, of course.
Of course. Now let's move on. Let's move on from Melbourne. Let's talk about the wider Australian market. It's not all about Victoria. In terms of the changes you've seen, the trends, you talked a little bit earlier about the adoption of Zoom technology and trust us, we do all day long. But in terms of the changes you've seen that practices are now implementing, what sort of trends do you see emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic that are starting to become the accepted norm in architectural practices?
Yeah, look, I think one of the biggest way we've seen changes in recruiting is probably interviewing, because people have had to move to Zoom or socially distanced interviews if they're coming back into the office. We're still seeing most practices are seeing people in person once they get to office stage. And I guess in some other states, apart from Victoria now, they might be seeing them face-to-face at first stage interview, but they're obviously wearing a mask, for example, and making sure that they're socially distancing. We actually had someone that we placed recently, I think, which is an interesting trend, someone coming back from Europe. And as always for these placements, they were always done via Zoom. But the good news is that practices are very, very flexible and happy to wait for unknown circumstances, like, you know, getting a return flight, because that's something that people can't really even book a flight sometimes, or they get bumped off, and practices are really happy to wait for that. And also the unknown quarantine period, depending on, you know, where they're coming from, where they're coming into, where they have to move within Australia, well, if they can still. I think there's a lot of unknowns, but people are really flexible, waiting for the right person. Another thing that we've seen is people are being very, very specific about their requirements, because they're, you know, a bit more nervous to commit to hiring people at the moment. So they need to be 100% sure that that fit is right before they commit, and they'll wait longer for that right person, even if they might be abroad or not available as quickly. We're seeing people really open to flexible hours and working from home as well, which is amazing. It's a, you know, really fast transition. But I'd say on average, still doing 2 interviews. It's definitely a slower process, just because of that caution, and also the fact that when you're doing remote interviews, the communication is not in person, so it can slow things down a bit.
You talked earlier as well, this is fascinating, about the sort of emerging architect group, and then you've got the established sort of middle section, and then you've got the highly experienced influential end of the architectural spectrum. And you said that the focus at the moment in terms of the recruitment is in that middle section. So graduates and those in the early stages of their career are sadly losing out on roles. Now, a lot of people on this program, a lot of people that join me week in, week out, are young architects, emerging architects. They don't have a lot of experience. So how do they stand out to potential employers when there is such a glut of fantastic candidates on the market?
Yeah, no, that is very true, and that is something that I suppose addressing in the future is going to be a potential issue with, you know, if we're not employing graduates of this level, then there's going to be a bulk that's kind of missing, is that mid-level in years to come. So it is also it's difficult when the roles aren't there and the demand isn't there for that sort of skill set, but we have realised that is going to be a gap in the future based on this. So with regards to some things that, say, candidates of that level can do in order to help get themselves into, I suppose, the market right now, are things like ensuring that they're networking, going to all types of events, whether virtual, different types of platforms that they can address, get exposure to, make sure their CV and their portfolio is ready and really up to date in the best form possible. It's also upskilling in areas that are in demand at the moment, so Revit and ArchiCAD skills. Making sure that they're open to all types of opportunities, so contract admin, submissions, part-time engagements, you know, consider contract roles, consider diverging across different disciplines if the demand is there. For example, I think Krista said in Brisbane and Sydney that, you know, landscape architecture and urban was quite strong, even though potential clients might not be as open to people with an architecture background. It's still, you know, if you're showing interest that you've got, you know, skill sets that can be applied to different things, then that's a positive in transferring your skills. It could be a good time to consider studying part-time if there's any sort of post-grad study you want to do in, say, urban or heritage, because those skills are in demand as well. And also basically emphasising any awards or successes at university that you have. If you're applying to jobs that are within walk or bike ride from your home, maybe emphasise this when you apply, especially to do with the restrictions at the moment. And if you have like a good computer setup or any software licenses, that's a good thing to note as well, because it might get you, you know, a foot in the door somewhere else that may not have that opportunity.
Do you both, and I'll put this question to both of you, it's a question that's come in on the chat, do you see any prospects for recent graduates, or is architecture, you know, sort of for those who are coming fresh out of university, is this a career that is going to be incredibly limited for the next few years as we recover?
Oh, look, I would say it is, I mean, from our perspective, I think it's hard for us to answer for everyone, but, you know, for us, the bulk of the roles that we feel are in that sort of mid-range, just by the very nature of what people and practices, how they're structured, I suppose. But we do have, as long as people are flexible, like Bianca was saying, I think, and you can get your foot in the door in any way, which might be because you live around the corner, you don't have to commute, or maybe because you've got something someone else doesn't have, or you can help out with graphics, or you're, you know, willing and open to do different things. And I think, you know, there are still people taking those people on. It's just the whole market is more competitive at the moment on all levels. So I think persist. Persist.
Yeah, it's a very good verb to adopt. But I suppose one thing that always concerns me, and one thing that we see a little bit at the Institute, is where we have fantastic young people, graduates, fresh out of college, really fantastically skilled, you know, bright-eyed and really keen to work in organisations, who then get adopted and used in some respects as slave labour under the elements of, you know, gaining experience. And I understand internships are valuable. They do add, you know, weight to a CV. But I suppose, how do we get our young people, and this is a question to you both, how do they safeguard themselves against getting abused in an environment where jobs are scarce?
I think, you know, when you're coming in and that negotiation at the beginning of what the expectations are and timeframes, we don't place any interns at all. Everybody that we find a role for, they are getting paid for those jobs. And I think, as long as they've got good mentoring and they know how long they're going to be doing the photocopying or doing some office management jobs, and they want to be learning how to, you know, in a proper graduate role, I think that's sort of, you know, that's just communication, isn't it, from the outset, and expectations. Yeah.
I suppose, and let's go back to some of the other questions that have come in, and this is just in relation to architects who are still in a job. And they're employed currently, but they're staying awake at night. And we have had many conversations with our members in relation to this. So what tips have you got for those who are employed currently, but worried about what's around the corner, what's happening, in terms of stage 2? What can you do to allay their fears and concerns?
Yeah, I would say if you are secure and employed and looking to move, I would say it is still a fine time to be looking for the right role, as there are still people hiring. So, however, just be mindful of leaving a permanent role for a contract, for example, seeing that's where the direction things are moving to at the moment. It might sound obvious, but make sure you're asking the right questions about practice work pipeline and sector diversity. So I'm finding that practices that are obviously across more sectors and have that diversity there are just more safeguarded in a climate such as this. So people who have strong skills relevant to a role and a practice who are employed at the moment may still have several options once they start looking. We have seen through both stages of lockdown this, in fact. So while we have many people looking for roles, there are still many practices who are finding it challenging to find the right person with the skills they need. So even if you are employed, you may be one of these niche people with the exact right skill set that someone is looking for. So there is definitely still potential there. I would just say to keep in mind that salaries have plateaued, so just be mindful of this. And lastly, I wouldn't resign until you have something else concrete and lined up. It will take longer than normal to find another role in this climate, so just be mindful of that. But there's still, a lot of opportunity there.
A question has come in from Jake on the chat, and this is a fascinating question and one that as recruiters and employers we always look for, and that's gaps on CVs. And so his question is this: for those out of work for quite a long time due to the coronavirus pandemic, will they be disadvantaged when looking for work, given there could be on their CV quite a long period of time between employment? What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I would say no. I mean, I think that line that we are all very much in this together, I think that's clients I speak to, people who are looking for roles, everybody's very aware of this situation being extreme and exceptional. And I just think if there's a gap on somebody's CV through this period, it's very, very understandable. And I don't think there'd be any negative connotations, to be honest. People who've made redundancies or had to be stood down, it's, they're very legitimate reasons. It's not for any other reason, I think.
Let's talk a little bit about JobKeeper. So as you know, JobKeeper has been quite a godsend for a lot of architectural practices. Just from your perspective, the clients that you've worked with, the clients that you're working with currently, are they using JobKeeper? Has this been able to ensure that they can retain staff, at least on maybe perhaps reduced hours?
Look, I think a lot of the people we're working with on roles now, they obviously are probably not as reliant on JobKeeper. A lot of our clients definitely that we speak to in the market are on JobKeeper. I think a lot of architects are. And a lot of other businesses, we also work with within the product sector, and a lot of those businesses would be on JobKeeper as well. But I'd say that people who are recruiting, because they won't get JobKeeper for new hires, a lot of those businesses are probably in a slightly different position and they haven't been able to access JobKeeper. And I think, I'm not sure about the future ones because I know there's different thresholds for people to be able to sort of qualify to get that. But I think, it has definitely given businesses that might have needed to make extra, compactions, confidence and that real bridge to 2021, which I think is, it's been really vital because, I think everyone was worried about that period over the architecture sector around Christmas, which is often a time where things do slow down because construction slows down as well. And people often don't hire permanent people when it comes up to December because of the Christmas break. So I think that kind of getting people through is really great, I think, for everyone.
Let's talk about those people that have, as we all know, hundreds of thousands of people have flown back into Australia. So we've had countries close down, shut their borders. It's easier for a lot of Aussie residents to now come back to Australia. In those crowds of people coming back to Australia, there has been a number of fantastically qualified and experienced architects who have practiced only overseas, but yet hold Australian residency permits or passports. So do you think that there's anything holding them back? Do you see that international experience, they might have practiced in Hong Kong, Dubai, London, perhaps, those global construction centres. Do you see any restriction or any negativity associated with only having international experience, but yet setting foot back into Australia?
Look, I would say in general, Australian practices are always really excited to get people coming back who have international experience because, that's great diversity within our sector. And I think in this market too, those people have still got great options to look at. They might not be looking at the ones they thought they'd normally look at, like another practice that has offices internationally but is in Australia. They might now be looking at a smaller mid-sized practice because they're the ones that are hiring. So I think you're seeing those people going into practices they might not normally have gone into, which is an amazing thing for a practice to be able to access that level of international talent and bring, experience from, larger scale projects or just diverse background. So I think that's actually, it's positive, but definitely there's a bit of a shift in where those people might be actually ending up in a role.
Let's look at the future challenges. So we're currently all in this together, like you say, but let's try and be positive and look to the future of the architectural profession. What do you think the future challenges for practices who are looking to recruit will be? What do you think the major roadblocks will be that they'll experience in the coming years?
Well, Michael, I think offering an agile and flexible workspace and employment types being set up in terms of IT for new starters, what they need to be able to work from home is going to be a big thing. So specifically being agile, allowing people to work from any location is going to be a real big benefit for both companies and employees. Attracting the best candidates. So what is different and appealing about how you have managed through this period? What is job security and opportunities for progression like in your practice? These are going to be some big things that in terms of, newcomers coming on board, and it's going to be a very competitive market as well. So being able to adapt to those changes and showing those differences that you can provide is going to be really beneficial. Staying visible in the market and maintaining networks through this period. So keeping all avenues open, whether it be architecture schools, ex-colleagues, new arrivals, maintaining a public profile through marketing and social media will be important as well. And raising the next, as we touched on this before, but raising the next crop of graduates. If there is less face-to-face mentoring, etc., in 2 years' time, there's not going to be that pool of capable, experienced grads that support the rest of the office. So this is going to be a challenge, we feel, throughout the industry. And also growing the next leaders and succession planning are always going to be challenges for all. So just being mindful of this. We also have seen in some of the recent trends as well, which sort of feeds on this a little bit, is that there have been quite a few promotions we've seen happening internally at practices. So generally, if a practice has the means and it's a viable option, people that have employees that are working there that have really adapted well to COVID, have mentored others through it, who've shown their resilience and also, really helped in their practice and the office come through the other side. We've seen a lot of promotions happening to, to show the gratefulness of these people. And so that really does lead to showing how people will sort of groom their next leaders and succession planning within the team as well.
What long-term trends then are you forecasting for architects in Australia from an office perspective, from a recruitment, from a workforce model? What are you seeing as a long-term trend emanating out of this?
Yeah. So I think the long-term trends is that, like Bianca mentioned, I think agility and being equipped to work remotely or in an office environment. We've seen many practices come back into the workplace in Brisbane and some in Sydney, and people tend to be doing a bit of a split of working from home and in office hours. This seems to be widely accepted as really positive. People need to also just be ready to do that flex at short notice, because you might get a case of something popping up in your office or there's something else happening that you need to be aware of. I think practices are looking really closely at what they lease and the economics around this and the large overhead of that office space. I think we'll see a bit of a trend for people to rethink this. Will they have more communal social space in the future for collaboration and design review? We've definitely seen some practices mention the difficulties in working on the design stage of projects remotely. So I'd imagine that there'll be some innovation around the technology we use when we're working collaboratively in a design environment. I'd also predict that there'll be really big changes to business travel. I've spoken to several people who used to fly interstate regularly who now say they've realised they don't need to meet face-to-face for certain meetings, including the internal and site meetings. I think this will be a really big change and a big dollar saving for national practices. I definitely predict the uptick of people working on contract, casual or fixed term arrangements through this period. We're already seeing that globally everywhere. And I think that just like a short-term trend that we're seeing right now, with the relative stability in the current market for Queensland, New South Wales, those people that might, like Bianca was talking about before, have been thinking about moving pre-pandemic and now starting to think cautiously about where they might go. We're seeing more people applying and starting to look. And that might be because they're unhappy with their current employment conditions. For example, some people have had to take an 80% pay cut but are working at 100% capacity. I'd say that that's probably just a short-term thing. I think another really big trend that we're definitely seeing is the appetite to move or return to Australia. As you mentioned before, Michael, we're receiving so many applications from people all over the world. Lots of them are returning Australians, but obviously others as well, wanting to come from all over the place. And they can't right now because the borders are closed. However, I think as soon as there's a bit of opening up on that front, I'd imagine there will be an increase, because we do love international architects in Australia, and I think people love, we're just a very appealing place to come to at the moment, given what's been going on.
The travel thing is definitely true. I mean, that for us as an organisation, we spend a little bit of money on sending jurors around to look at, sites for our architectural awards program, that sort of things. And this has obviously restricted us a great deal. And even this morning, we've seen the Northern Territory close their borders for at least another 18 months. So, travel is really off the cards. And so I think the accountants in every architectural organisation are now looking at the bottom line going, oh, this isn't too bad, I suppose in terms of just my final couple of questions to you, one thing that we've been particularly aware of is the occasional case that comes to us at the Institute of Architects here, which is in relation to people being laid off unfairly. And this is a question that I'm conscious that you may not have the answer to, but we have had a number of people who have felt that they have been let go from architecture practices only because, on a basic premise that, the economic downturn has affected the practice, and in fact it is to get rid of the troublemaker or the noisy person or the person that doesn't fit from a cultural perspective. What are your thoughts on those sort of issues that sometimes can come to the surface?
Yeah, look, I think that's again very tricky, and obviously that's not how things are meant to have been done through this period. And I would say there have been, I don't know whether that's true or not, but I would say there've been the redundancies and the people stood down and the people we've been speaking to, a lot of them are very legitimate, and practices, I think it's been, heartbreaking and incredibly stressful, and there's huge financial pressures, and a lot of people, it's very, very legitimate, and I would hope that that is the case with everyone, but I don't think we can really answer that. It's if that is the case, it's terrible, really.
Yeah, no, true. It was a long shot question. It was just a concern email from a member who felt that they had been made redundant unfairly. But that's why we have Fair Work Australia.
I think, my advice would be call Fair Work.
Yeah, I'm sure Fair Work are probably quite busy at the moment. But
yes.
My final question to you is just in relation to economic stimulation. So the governments around Australia, we've seen, a lot of shovel-ready projects be brought to the front of the queue. We've seen the government really, in many areas and states and territories, really sort of kickstart projects much earlier than anticipated to keep the construction, the built environment, the architecture community quite stimulated from an economic perspective. Are you seeing a lot more, I suppose, public sector work come in?
Yeah, I think the practices that we've tended to be have been hiring through this. We've had a couple that have had competitions that have been sort of pushed through that might not have been strictly government, but that's been one area where people have needed someone urgently to work on a competition to win work, because they may have had to have, lost someone that they needed to keep going back to wherever they were from or something like that in the pandemic. So I think there's definitely a bit of that. And then public sector, we've still seen, education, infrastructure, and health, some health, they're busy.
And my final question to you, compared to, say, this time last year when the word coronavirus was foreign to us, the word COVID-19 had never been mentioned, if you're doing a year-on-year comparison, difference-wise for Bespoke Careers?
Yeah, look, I'd say, we've had to, compact globally as well. And we're obviously very frontline in terms of when a market is unsteady. We have seen lots of things like GFCs before. This is very fresh, a pandemic. But we're also frontline when things start to come back. I think here things are a lot better than we thought they might have been. We're probably at about, I'd say 60% of the roles that we had pre-pandemic, which is actually really great. And I'd say that's really positive. I'd say globally, it's probably not the same story just because those markets are not as far ahead as we are here, which I think is just purely related to the virus. But I'd say, yeah, something like 60% would be where I'd say it's at the moment, which again, I think that's really, really good.
If we have candidates who are looking for work, if we have architectural employers who are looking to hire, what's the best way to get in touch with you both?
If you just go to the website, it's probably the easiest, or www.bespokecareers.com. We're obviously spending a lot of time helping people who are looking for roles, and we do want to help everyone. That's what we're here for. And we've obviously got clients who are still finding it hard to find the right people for the roles that they need to fill. It's obviously changing a bit, but and it's different every day. And some people, some days we get people calling in with urgent briefs, and other days it's not as urgent. But I think we're in a good position globally. So in touch, and we will do everything we can to help.
And I suppose from the Institute's perspective, we've worked with Bespoke Careers for a long, long time. I mean, this is not just a recruitment agency per se. You are all, experienced architects in your own right. You've worked in the profession, you've worked across the built environment, and this is why that level of expertise works so well, is because you actually can understand. And when you do talk about Revit, when you do talk about ArchiCAD, and you talk about all of those sort of different technologies and tools that our members use, you completely understand that, which is great. So I think we'll leave it there, but thank you so much for joining me. Krista Shearer, Managing Director, and Bianca Nicastro, Principal from Sydney and Melbourne, respectively, from Bespoke Careers. I hope everybody on the call today found that insightful, and it was just really interesting to, I suppose, avoid the gossip and the innuendo and the rumours that you hear on the street and go straight to, the sources of expertise. So thank you, Krista and Bianca, for your time today. We really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining our program.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Absolute pleasure. So that's it for today, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you found that beneficial. Don't forget to join me again on Thursday at 12 noon. We have another lean in where we're going to be talking about passive house design, and I'm going to be joined by Timo Bleeker. He's an expert from Western Australia, and so do join me on Thursday at 12 noon to discuss that program. That is it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. As always, I've been Michael Linke here at the Australian Institute of Architects. Thanks for spending the last few minutes with me, but look forward to catching up with you on Thursday. Until then, do stay safe and look forward to seeing you soon.